Hey, it's Alabama Annie with another episode of Stories and Songs for you. As you can see, I have made quite a transition here. I am Raggedy Alabama Annie today because I've been out working in the yard and didn't want to take the time to clean up right now because I'll be going back out soon. But I thought Raggedy Annie and her resonator guitar could be your hostess for this episode. It's entitled The Family, and it's a story that I was told in Boulder Creek, California, by an elderly woman of good standing who had lived in the Redwoods near Big Basin all of her life. She was 86 years old, was born and raised there, living all her life in the same house. When she learned that I wrote stories about various topics, she told this one to me, but made me promise never to use her name or give the exact location of her home. In California, despite it being one of the most populous states in the country, there are still vast remote wilderness areas of undeveloped land, thank God. Among those millions of acres, there are some places where possibly no human has set foot, with deep hollows and steep ridges where the sun barely shines. It's here in these places that the family lived, protected by the elements beneath the redwoods and rock this land provides. There was such a place an hour's walk from an old farm along a little used trail that led up the side of a ridge and down again into a hidden hollow where only a few beams of sunlight filtered through the lofty boughs of the redwood, dancing on the trickling waters of a babbling stream. Now she says, it was here that I went with my grandmother one warm spring day, moving slowly and quietly along the trail in bare feet. She had on her kitchen apron, as she always did, and a walking stick in her hand, and me, holding her other one, in my coveralls, with a piece of gum in my mouth and a sack with 3 apples in it. When we stopped to rest at the foot of a ridge, she made me promise I'd never tell a soul about the place she was taking me or where it was. She made me pinky swear and said I wouldn't live a long life if I didn't. Then she told me what I must do when we arrived at this place she was taking me. You mustn't never speak above a whisper, nor make loud noises or move quickly. And if they come, young lady, she said, you must never, ever look them in the eye. They get angry when you do that, and it upsets them something awful. I listened and I nodded my head and I promised I would do exactly as she'd told, and I wondered what on earth I was about to see. We continued on, making slow progress up that ridge, avoiding the briars of blackberry bushes and loose stones, climbing higher and higher until we reached the top and stood gazing down at a beautiful rolling valley and the mountains rising up to the sky. I followed her down the other side of the ridge, down into deep shade where she paused and held her finger to her mouth. Shh, she said, we're almost there. I followed her down to a bed of soft moss on the banks of a small stream, and she sat down cross-legged on the moss, and I did the same, waiting in anticipation for whatever was coming. Some time passed, and there were only the sound of the water and the wind, and I began to fidget as children will. But suddenly we heard movement up the side of the far ridge and looked that way. At first I didn't see a thing but some leaves rustling in the wind, and then there was something. My heart beat so hard in my chest that it sounded like a drum. I could not believe what I was seeing. He looked like a gorilla I'd seen once in a big top circus that came to town, but then again, he was more like a small man, with a broad chest and thick arms and legs, but heavy set like a gorilla. He was covered in blackish brown hair, head to toe, moving cautiously and very slowly from tree to tree beside a tall oak. He paused, watching us intently. Grandma smiled at me and held her fingers to her mouth again for me to stay quiet, and then she made a short humming sound to the creature. She made the sound again, and he turned his head, looking behind him up the ridge as another of them appeared, This one smaller than him and lighter in color with something in its arms. It was a she, and she was holding a baby. She moved cautiously down toward him until she stood by his side. As I watched in awe, Grandmother made the sound again, that short and they slowly came down the ridge to the other side of the brook. Without taking her eyes off me, the mother sat down on the moss, cradling the baby gently in her arms, its bright little face peering out at us, and the father crouched beside her, watching us closely, able to spring at the first hint of danger. Grandmother reached slowly into her apron pocket and brought out a handful of biscuits left over from breakfast. She held the biscuits in her hand, and the big one stood up, stooping like a man, reaching across the narrow little brook with his long, powerful arm. Gently, he removed the biscuits from my grandmother's hand and turned, passing one to the mother. They sat eating that bread, munching thoughtfully as they watched us, and when the biscuits were gone, Grandmother turned to me. "Apples," she whispered as I fumbled in the bag. "Hold them out," she said. "Hold them out in your hands." My hands were shaking as I held out the apples, and he stood again, reaching out, his eyes looking deeply into mine, bright, shiny eyes that danced with curiosity. He took the apples from my hand ever so gently, crouching down again as we all sat beside the brook, the baby wriggling in its mother's arms as she made cooing noises and nursed the infant at her breast. Grandmother spoke in a soft, sing-song voice. "Beautiful baby," she said, as the mother looked at her with innocent, doe-like eyes. Then Grandmother turned her palms up on her apron and lowered her head, and after a moment, the male stood again. My grandmother rose to her feet, and I stood beside her watching as the mother stood as well, adjusting the baby in her arms. And together they turned, moving up the ridge again, looking back at us only once before they disappeared into the shadow and the shade. Grandmother turned to me and smiled. "We'll go now too," she said, as I looked at her in wonder. "Who were they?" I asked. But she shushed me and moved on up the ridge again to the top, where we paused for a moment. "What do you think they were?" she asked, looking down at the brook, waiting for me to reply. After I thought about them for a moment, I said, "They were a family, a big, old, hairy family." She laughed then and said, "We must never tell anyone about them," saying that if we did, they might be killed, and I promised. I crossed my fingers and hoped to die. We pinky sweared again. My grandmother took me back to the hollow twice more over the next few years, but our friends did not make an appearance. And I went back to that place in the hollow once after Grandmother passed away, bringing apples, hoping that I would see them, but I never did. There were stories, though, from time to time, about a farmer who lived near us. He claimed he'd seen what he thought was an ape in his garden, and once news got out about an engineer on the railroad up at the logging camp who said he'd seen several of them along the tracks in the bright lights of the locomotive one night. I never have talked about this before, so I hope you won't ever use our names, because even though my grandmother is gone, she wouldn't like it very much at all that I'd broken my promise. But the day she took me to see them was a moment I will never forget. So I hope you enjoyed that story, and now here is a short little song to go with it. It's called "Nobody Here But Me." Feed the flame of an evening fire, moon shining through them trees. Sing along with the whippoorwill Thank you for listening. This is Alabama Annie, and I will be back again soon with another episode of Stories and Songs.